Since the start of this aggression of Russia against Ukraine, the country remained very consolidated around the political and military goal to restore its territorial integrity in the borders that are legally recognized in 1991. And there was a consensus that all other divisions and internal discourse that took place before the war was put aside. But of course, Ukraine is a democracy. It's not consolidated democracy, but it's a very vibrant political and civil society. And we already see some of the issues that are emerging in an internal debate inside Ukraine. So there are three blocks of these issues. One is security, another one is economy, and the third one is the health of democracy. On security side, it's the main goal of President Zelenskyy is to marshal military support for Ukrainian armed forces to ensure successful performance on the battlefield. But there are issues, of course, that are being asked about the integrity of military procurement at the Ministry of Defense and how successful and efficient it is in procuring necessary armaments and how fast and effective they can reach the battlefield. And obviously, Ukrainians want to have a security arrangement that includes NATO membership. And it is supported by more than 70% of Ukrainians. So this is a challenge that President Zelenskyy has to deliver because there's demand for it. And it's not an easy one. The second one is, of course, economy. Ukraine is facing a serious economic downfall due to Russian aggression. Its economy may fall up to 40% this year, and Ukraine heavily relies on Western assistance and its own ability to collect taxes and to have its budget filled with necessary funds. So here, there's also a question of how to sustain that economic support. And to be honest, Western assistance was coming, but it was not enough, and it was quite slow. A lot of funds were coming from the United States. The European Union was slow, and Ukraine also had to spend quite a lot of its own federal reserve, its currency reserves, to sustain hryvnia. So Ukrainians are worried that if the National Bank keeps printing hryvnia to sustain the deficit, the country may spiral into hyperinflation, and they are closely watching the economic policy of Zelenskyy's government. And finally, on democracy, there's a discussion about the quality of media space. Of course, under the martial law, there is a certain censorship and confidentiality of information, especially related to the military operation. But, for example, there is now a United National TV channel program that combines all TV channels into one programming. But some TV channels were excluded from that programming, mostly related to the opposition, those affiliated, for example, with the party of ex-President Poroshenko. There are issues whether this was done on purpose to limit the influence of political opposition, and media environment, journalists also are, for example, pushing for dismissal of journalists who previously were, for example, voicing Russian propaganda on Ukrainian TV channels. So you see quite vibrant discussion related to democracy. Overall, Ukrainians have an overwhelming support for President Zelenskyy. Over 90% approve his performance. They think that he has managed to, on one hand, mount a quite substantial opposition to withhold Russian aggression in Ukraine, but also mobilize Western support in this conflict. And this is something that is highly appreciated by Ukrainians, and they believe that his personal behavior by staying in Kyiv, not fleeing the country, was able to stabilize the situation. But of course, at this point, there are some frictions that could be observed more between the national and regional levels, because again of the martial law, a lot of local self-governance have been abolished, and regions became under direct jurisdiction of national military administrations that are run by appointees of President Zelenskyy. And this comes after the period of quite strong decentralization, where mayors and local councils had a lot of power. And they are now asking the question, how much of this centralization can carry on? For example, issues that are not related to a military opposition and military affairs. So some of the mayors, for example, would like to have more responsibility in recovery, in deciding the priorities, in organizing more transparent tenders and funding. But overall, the country remains united and in support of Zelenskyy's policy. Since February 24th, it was clear in Ukraine that Putin is waging a colonial war that is here to destroy Ukraine as an independent nation state. So for Ukraine, this is an existential war, the war that must preserve Ukrainian statehood as we know it. And that is why when we look at the Ukrainian aspiration towards this, the outcome of this war, there's a very strong consensus in the society that Russian troops must be pushed out of all of Ukrainian territory, all the way to the officially recognized borders. More than 50% of Ukrainians support this position. But what is also interesting, Ukrainians understand that they will not be secure until Russian military is defeated and overall Russian political leadership goes through a certain revolution of thinking and approach to really recognize independence of Ukraine. And over 20% of Ukrainians believe that Ukrainian military should inflict the big damage to Russian army and even support some insurgency inside Russia to weaken Putin's regime. There's very little appetite for territorial concessions. Only about 10% would support victory where Crimea remains occupied by the Russian Federation. How realistic all of this agenda is, I mean, but every day it becomes more and more realistic as we see the West also supports Ukraine's desire to prevail and win in this conflict and works towards Putin's failure. Of course, the most recent escalation where Putin is annexing the newly occupied territories will cause some complications on this strategy, but I don't think that it will be determinant for the future of this war. And even the mobilization inside Russian Federation will hardly change very much the outlook on the battlefield. But what is needed for this strategy to be successful is obviously unity within Ukraine. It's financial and military assistance from the West that is coming timely and in a strategic way. It is also enlargement of the anti-Russian coalition, because at this point it's more pro-democratic Western world that is supporting sanction and providing armaments to Ukraine. But as we see now, standing by and being neutral is actually taking the side of the aggressor, and countries in the global south, from India to South Africa and Brazil, have to carefully think how they be viewed by future generations in this war. So all in all, if Ukraine maintains its successful counteroffensive, unity inside, and the West has support for Ukraine, I believe this is a possible scenario. It's not a fast outcome that we can expect, but it will be, all of us will be better off, because if Ukraine restores its territorial integrity, then we can speak about new European security architecture and return to a more rule-based international order.